A different perspective on the economics of Brexit now. Andrew Lilico was the lead economist for the official Leave referendum campaign. He's now executive director and principal of the consulting group Europe Economics. There have been several economic forecasts in the past week or so, and you've been critical of many of them, but you said the forecast from the Bank of England was absurd. That's pretty strong language. Why?
Well, the Bank of England's forecast included the possibility that GDP would contract by 8% in 1 year. Now, that's twice as much as the worst contraction on record in the year in the UK, which is that of the financial crisis in 2009. That's more than 3 times as much as the second worst contraction in the early 1970s. It's absolutely absurd contraction that they propose. It's not the kind of thing associated with a recession or any kind of normal economic event. That's the sort of thing that happens if you have a famine or you're occupied by a foreign power. It's preposterous to suggest that. And one of the things with the Bank of England forecast was that although it made headlines as a forecast, they then attended some weasel words about it really being some sort of stress test downside scenario analysis. Well, they said that the document that they were producing was responding to a request from the Treasury Select Committee for them to analyse what some of the impacts of Brexit might be on the economy. So the actual document purported to be an analysis of what would happen in the economy, and then they came out with absolutely ridiculous suggestions of what that might be. I think they've damaged their credibility here.
At the same time, almost all of the economic forecasts now suggest there will be economic trouble, that the economy is not going to perform as well, deal or no deal. What do you think we need to understand about that?
Well, I think that, look, I have come from things with quite a conservative political outlook, and so I expect that significant change involves cost. So it wouldn't be surprising to me if there were some costs associated. In fact, it would be very surprising to me if you could do something as significant as leaving the European Union without there being some short-term costs associated with it. Indeed, the opinion polls suggested that prior to the referendum, most people thought there would be short-term transitional costs associated. But what I mean by that is the kind of thing which the OECD or various respectable economic forecasters suggested, which is something like 2 to 3% sacrifice of growth. So perhaps if we would have grown at 2.5% a year for 3 years, then instead we go at 1.5% a year for 3 years. That sort of non-trivial. It's an important amount of resource GDP that you lose from that. But it's that kind of loss which I would then expect to make up over the medium term in various ways. I'll come to in a moment. But other forecasters think you wouldn't. But those are not 8% contractions in GDP, which is just a completely different thing again. One of the things I think it's worth understanding here is most of the analyses that you've seen produced, and for example, the UK Treasury produced another analysis yesterday, ascribe nothing to any of the material benefits that are associated with Brexit. The nature of Brexit is that it involves sacrificing a concrete loss. So we increase our trade barriers with the European Union for quite a diffuse, intangible and uncertain gain, namely the greater ability for us to set policy in our own interests, which comes with greater control. Now, it's obviously not certain that you would use greater control in ways that were beneficial for you. We might make some stupid mistakes. We might, at the moment, we have in the UK an opposition party which is verging on the communist. So if we were to elect communists as our government, then we would make a very bad use of control. On the other hand, we have the opportunity from having greater control over what we do to deal better with the regulatory challenges of the future, adjust to artificial intelligence, driverless cars, new green technologies, the commercial exploitation of space, all the kinds of new things that might turn up tomorrow. We have the opportunity to deal with them better by doing them ourselves than we would as members of the European Union. So by directing policy in these ways, which of course are uncertain, we should, but if we do it better, then we should expect to gain from that economically. That's very hard to quantify. The normal thing that economists do in these kinds of situations is if things are uncertain and hard to quantify, they will very often just say, well, I'll put that in the box of qualitative effects, and maybe I ascribe naught or some notional 0.1% or something allowance for those. That's what most of the orthodox economic analyses of Brexit have done. They have assumed away any of the benefits, economic benefits associated with it, because they're just too hard for them to measure. I've attempted ways of quantifying some of these things. So, and I think it's very disappointing that they've not really attempted to quantify any of those things at all. So what they've done is just say, if it's the case that there are all these concrete losses and all the benefits are worthless, then we make some losses. Well, yes, I mean, obviously, I'm not disputing that.
One of the benefits, and I guess this would come with control, is an arrangement that has been called Canada Plus. What would that look like in terms of trade?
So what we're suggesting, so some people have suggested that the most natural model for the UK, once we've left the EU, is a third party, what's called a third party relationship with the European Union. So that means that we would have the same sort of relationship with the European Union that many other non-EU countries have around the world. So that would be the Canadian deal, they're called CETA, was the sort of iconic first one of those, but the Comprehensive Economic Trading Agreement is the CETA agreement, and there's a similar deal applied to Korea and to Japan and various other countries that the European Union is looking at. So under that sort of arrangement, we would just be free trade partners, much the same way that Canada is with the European Union. The plus means perhaps we'd add a little bit more in some areas like financial services or some things of that sort. So we'd add a few extras to the deal to reflect the differences between us and some of these other countries. But if we didn't get the plus and it was just a Canada deal, that would be fine as well. So that's what we mean by a Canada Plus deal. It's a similar type of relationship with the EU to the one that Canada has.
Just briefly, I know you're not necessarily a betting man, but you are a bit of a forecaster. What do you think the most likely scenario is now over the next few weeks?
So Theresa May's deal will certainly be rejected. Then we have a situation where it's probably a little bit more than 50% is the likelihood that we then just end up with an outright no deal. And a little bit less than 50% is that Parliament panics in some way and tries to defer Article 50, the point at which we leave the European Union, or perhaps try to have a second referendum. I believe that a second referendum would be much more likely than not to go the way of leave anyway. So and of course, if you left in a second referendum, then there'd be no deal. So the great likelihood is that we leave the European Union now with no deal at all with the European Union. Whether we then, having left with no deal, would quite quickly enter into some sort of minor deal, or whether we tough out no deal, that's a little bit uncertain. I'm guessing that we would come to some sort of managed no deal arrangement, but it's also possible that the way things have gone, everybody's become so bad-tempered with each other that we'd end up with no deal at all.
Thank you very much for your perspective on this.
You're most welcome.